In this video, I want to just briefly wrap up the discussion of different kinds of barriers to entry. One that is discussed in your reading is something called a network effect. And that holds in certain kinds of markets that have a special characteristic. And as I've written here, the characteristic is that the value of whatever the firm is providing depends on how many other customers there are. So each new customer is going to think only of the value of this thing to themselves, but by joining, by acquiring the firm's product, this customer is also offering existing customers some kind of a benefit, because everyone benefits the more other people there are also consuming the firm's product. Now that sounds a little bit abstract and rather unusual, but if you think about examples, you will find that in fact they're all around us. Just think for a moment and see whether anything comes to mind. How about something like Twitter? If there's hardly anybody on Twitter, there's not going to be anything very interesting on it to read, and there'll be few other people to communicate with. The more people there are, of course, the more interesting stuff there might be, and the more attractive would it be to join Twitter. The same could be said for Facebook. The same would hold for sites where people want to sell things, like Kijiji or eBay. So if you wanted to sell something on eBay, if there was hardly anyone else on it paying attention to it, then it wouldn't be very attractive. You wouldn't be very likely to find a customer or to get a good price for what you were selling. So the more people that there are using that particular good or that particular service, the more valuable it is for everyone. Well, this obviously has the point in terms of a barrier to entry that the firm that's already there, which we use the term incumbent firm. So the incumbent firm is the firm that's already in the market. We can say that it has what's called a first mover advantage. So if you're the first into a market, that gives you an advantage over others. We saw that in the previous example in terms of the experience curve. So somebody who's been in a market longer has an advantage. In this case, they have an advantage simply because they've got a lot of customers already. So any new entrant into the market is going to face the fact that they don't have any customers. So it's not going to be very attractive to sign up and use their service. Well, your text a little bit later on has a discussion, a kind of pricing strategy that a firm that's trying to break into this market might use. I'll just leave you to read that on your own. It's called penetration pricing. So the idea would be, very briefly, to perhaps offer your services for free or offer some kind of an inducement for people to sign up with you. And if they like your service, then maybe they'll stick with it and more people will join. Well, let's think of something else. Your text refers to the idea of a cartel. I'm sure that's a word that many of you have heard. And a cartel is just a group of firms, usually a fairly small number of firms, that cooperate with each other. And their objective is to maximize their profits in some collective way. This is something that we're going to be looking at in more detail in a couple of weeks. But the idea is mentioned here, so I thought I would at least introduce it. cartel behavior is characterized by a variety of things that, again, we're going to look at a little bit later in the course. So firms might fix prices at some high level. They might agree with each other as to who is going to charge what for the good or the service. They might try to keep those prices high by restricting their output. So if you just think about a demand curve, the lower is the amount that you offer for sale, the higher the price that you could charge. Cartels could also cooperate and divide up the market so that everybody has a particular region to themselves. That's kind of a classic way that organized crime operates. So everybody has their own territory. And occasionally they may fight about that territory, but they would prefer to have peace, of course, and cooperation. This kind of behavior that I've just described is, at least in Canada, illegal, and probably illegal in many other countries. Well, one thing that cartels will do, of course, if they're going to be effective, is they're going to have to keep out the competition in one way or another. So they would try and raise some sort of barriers to entry. Your reading also refers to some other barriers to entry that come about as a result of government action. So one thing that governments enforce is intellectual property, sometimes abbreviated as IP. Well, you're going to be familiar with these ideas, I think. The idea of patents, which applies to physical goods and to processes like production processes. That allows the patent owner to prevent anybody else from making that good or using that process unless they pay for the privilege. Pharmaceuticals, pharmaceutical drugs are a very obvious example of the importance of patents. One of the reasons that pharmaceutical drugs are often so ridiculously expensive is because the owner of a patent has the sole right to produce that drug and can charge, in some countries at least, certainly in the United States, it can charge whatever price it wants. In some countries, pharmaceutical prices are regulated. Well, another kind of intellectual property holds for copyright. So copyright deals with creative works, like novels, works of literature, music, software, and so on. And the period of copyright is quite long, providing quite a lot of protection. And another type of intellectual property are trademarks. So things like company logos, for example, or designs of things. So for example, the McDonald's arch is a trademark symbol. So, of course, companies use trademarks as a way of conveying information to potential buyers that this is their good and not some copied good or counterfeit good. Well, all of these kinds of intellectual property offer their owners some monopoly power. It prevents other people from entering the market and imitating what they're doing. The purpose, of course, of this kind of intellectual property is to encourage research and development, innovation, the development of new products and processes, new creative works, and so on, allowing the owner of the intellectual property to at least get some profits for some period of time and to recover their costs. Drug companies, for example, are always making claims about the enormous costs involved in developing a drug, and so in that way trying to justify their monopoly power and their very high prices. Your reading also mentions the idea of licensing. I don't really entirely agree with the discussion that's in the text. If you think about something like the licensing of doctors or dentists or other professionals, such as engineers, for example, this is not really a barrier to entry unless the government restricts the number of licenses. So if people can simply go to school and acquire a license to carry out a particular profession, then that's not really a barrier to entry. It is a cost that somebody who wants to get a license is going to have to pay. But by itself, that's not really a barrier to entry. It's just another cost. Similarly, your reading refers to the costs of meeting government regulations. So, for example, there's all kinds of regulations regarding building codes and what's required in order to build a safe building. The same goes for health and safety regulations that might be applying to a workplace or to a product that's being developed. Well, again, these are just costs of doing business, and in and of themselves, I don't think they're a barrier to entry. Now, it does mean that in order to meet those rules and regulations, you again may need some costs. You may face some costs up front in order to get into business. So to the extent that it's difficult to raise capital, to raise the revenues that would get you started, indeed that might add to the difficulties of entering the market. But I don't think that means that the regulation itself is necessarily a barrier. I suppose I should just add the obvious, that licensing and these kinds of regulations are there for the public good. They're not there as an attempt to construct a barrier to entry like intellectual property is. So to the extent that it does make it more difficult to enter a profession or to provide a product, that's probably being done for good reason. Let's now turn to think about what kinds of strategies firms might adopt to try to keep out entrants into their market.